What did you notice? Could you just hand the paper to anybody and they could sign on whichever line they first came to that was open? No. What was the difference between each of the questions? Were they describing different traits? Yeah. So isn't that our expectation? You wouldn't have expected when you first saw this that you would be able to just go to the first person and they could sign along everything, right? You expected there to be differences in what they could sign, right? We understand that as adults, and yet when it comes to infants and toddlers, the thought that they might have different temperaments and different likes and wants and needs based on that temperament is really difficult for us to understand as caregivers. We think they all want their bottle the same way, they all want to be held the same way, they all like the lights the same way, they all like to be rocked the same way, and yet, over the last 11 weeks, what have you hopefully learned by now? That's not true. Every infant has their own temperament, just like every adult has their own temperament. So we're going to spend some time today identifying what this means to have different temperament. And we're going to categorize it into 3 different groups, but on those groups, there's 9 different temperament traits that we're going to take a look at, okay? And so once we're done, hopefully either with today or with, what day is it today? Wednesday. Or Monday, it's going by way quick. You'll be able to complete that section in the portfolio. And this is one of the larger sections in the portfolio because you're going to have possibly 9 different observations that correspond to the 9 different temperament traits. Okay, so hopefully we'll get through a lot of that today. If not, I'm not too worried about it. We'll bleed over into Monday. It is what it is. All right, so understanding temperament is the key to establishing a relationship. We might have looked at this quote already in a previous, no, we looked at something similar. Why do you think understanding temperament is a key to a relationship with an infant and toddler? Or with anybody, but with an infant and toddler, why is it such an important thing to understand? We haven't even talked about temperament. What will your guess be?
Building a relationship and trust.
But why is temperament so important? Why is understanding temperament so important to doing that? Yeah, to building a relationship. Why do you think understanding temperament is so important to building a relationship?
So that you know how to treat them or how they like certain things, and they'll tell you yes or no, or the way they act will show if they like it or not.
Right. So to build a relationship, we just can't treat infants the way we want to be treated, right? That's not the golden rule. It doesn't apply. We need to treat them the way they need to be treated, okay? That's an important distinction to understand. So why do we study it? Oh, see, this is why my clicker is handy to have. Oh, well. So understanding the temperament is understanding how the infant interacts with the world. Does every infant and toddler choose to approach the world in a different way? I hope you've seen this already, and this is one of the nice things about looking at this lecture so far into the semester, is you've spent a lot of time with those infants or toddlers. Do they each have a certain way that they like to be held? That they like to go down for nap? That if you were to hand them some gooey, sticky, weird substance, does each of them approach it very differently? And if you're in the older ones, that makes it a little bit more applicable. For the younger infants, do some of them like to be rocked on their side or sitting up? I was just having a conversation with Megan, and I don't know, who was the little girl April that had the yellow hat on?
Holly.
Holly. She likes to sleep like this, and Megan said as soon as you turn her like this, she wakes up and cries. That's temperament. So understanding those is understanding how they interact with the world, making those relationships based on what they need and what they want. Understanding how they interact with the world affects a child's reactions to other people and the environment. This is one of the reasons why we limit the amount of lab students, especially in an infant and toddler room. Do some have a very difficult time when new people come in? Every infant and toddler needs a little bit of time to adjust, but for some, if you look at their temperament, might it take 18 weeks for them to even smile at you? Yes, that's temperament. So if we constantly had new people in there, would they be able, with an infant with what's called a slow to warm temperament, would they be able to relax? No. And so understanding those individual things about the temperament allows us to, as caregivers, to monitor the environment to meet those needs. It's a window to the relationship with the child. We've discussed this in detail. Understanding how the child interacts with their needs and what their wants are, it gives you a window into what what they need in order to build that relationship. What we do have to be careful, it's not a way to label them. And especially when we have what we deem feisty children, we just put that label on them. Oh, they're feisty, oh, they're feisty, oh, they're feisty, and that explains everything about them. Understanding temperament is a way for us to understand how they approach the world, is a way for us to understand how they interact with their environment, is a way to establish a relationship, but it doesn't mean that we put them into this category and know this is always how they're going to act, they're just feisty, that's what they're going to do. Okay, we have to make sure that it doesn't become a label. Feisty, a lot of times children are labeled as difficult or challenging. Spirited is a good way that we choose to label it. But automatically when we choose to put a label, if I were to say a child was feisty, do you start getting a picture of maybe how they are at nap time, or how they are at snack time, or how they are when someone takes the ball from them? So because of that label, have you formed a picture of a child that I haven't even said anything about except the fact they're feisty? Yeah, we do that. So we really want to be careful that we don't use it to just label the children. So if you ever hear yourself saying, oh, he's feisty, that's a label. And you're using it so that the person you're talking to can sum it all up and know this child. And that's not the appropriate way. Okay? But it will be a temptation, I guarantee it. All right. So what does temperament mean to you? We're going to skip that because we don't have time. Usually we talk and discuss and you say this is what temperament means, and you're all brilliant so you know what it means, right? Yes. Okay. So the causes of individual difference in temperament can be classified into two major categories: biological influence and environment and other influences. Children are different the day they're born from one another. How many of you have been around more than one newborn? Are they all alike? Do some newborns, sleep through the night? First night, they go, you put them in their crib, 6 hours later, they wake up and eat. There are some, apparently, I don't have them, but newborns that are like that. And are there some, and these are mine, that until they are 9 months old, they cry every hour and a half to be fed? Was it 9 months? It was about 6 months. And that's a temperament. It doesn't matter what you do, that is who they are. That is their temperament. Okay? It's an inborn difference. And we see this from the second day of life, from the first day of life, how they approach the environment. But our temperament is also shaped by the environment we're placed in. So we really have to have an understanding that as caregivers, you're given an infant and toddler that already has an established temperament based on their biological influences, based on the home environment, but you also have the responsibility to support their temperament because of the environment you offer. Okay? We don't just throw up their hands and say, oh, they're just born that way. There's certain ways that we can help support temperaments that maybe will cause them to be less successful in society, especially if we're going to look at slow to warm children in that regard. All right. So the genetic component is usually stronger for what we consider negative, and I have it in quotes because it doesn't mean it's bad. It's just what is categorized or labeled, again, those ugly words, as a negative emotion. So we think of things as moodiness, slow to approach, reactivity. These are different labels. These have a larger genetic trait. So if you see a child that has a high reactivity, if they fall and stumble and they're screaming for 3 hours, that is more genetically linked than some of the what we consider positive temperament traits, where they have low reactivity, or they approach new things with vigor versus standing back and waiting a while to approach. So we know that there's a stronger genetic component for what's considered negative traits, and we also know that it's fairly constant over time. So an infant that has trouble sleeping for their first month, first 2 months, first 3 months, typically they won't be a good sleeper for the rest of their life. If you have a hard time sleeping as an adult, if you talk to your parents, you probably were not that great of a sleeper as an infant and toddler. And you can probably remember that. If you have a hard time sleeping now as an adult, you probably didn't fall asleep or sleep very well as an adolescent or as a child. It's pretty consistent over time. if you're very scheduled as far as you eat breakfast at 6 a.m., you have lunch at 12, and you have dinner at 5 p.m., you were probably like that as a child too. You wanted to have breakfast at a certain time. You needed to have lunch at a certain time. You needed to have dinner at a certain time. And if things were a little bit wonky, it was more difficult for you to adjust. Okay? These can change slightly, but what we do see is that temperaments are fairly stable over time. So if you have a toddler that screams for 3 hours at a time, they're probably going to go through times when they're an adult where they're very quote-unquote moody, and they have a more rough adolescence. My oldest is like this. I am not looking forward to the teenage years because she was a very difficult toddler. She would just scream for 2 hours at a time, made herself throw up, all those fun things. So we know the adolescence because this is her temperament, and she still has screaming fits that last 2 to 3 hours. Because this is her temperament, it's going to be like that when she's a teenager, and it's going to be like that when she's 16. And these are because we know the research, or I know the research, and I tell my husband, we tell her, you're going to battle this temptation the rest of your life. You're going to battle this temptation to scream, scream, scream at the top of your lungs for the rest of your life. Because this is your temperament. You've got to find a more productive way to deal with it. You ever seen an adult throw a tantrum? They do it, right? They do. They're all over YouTube. You know, Google adult throwing tantrum, and they're there. They're screaming at people. They're throwing things. That's a tantrum. That's not learning how to deal with it. That's an inborn temperament. And this is where that environment factors comes into play. The adult might have the temptation because their temperament to throw a tantrum, but because of the environmental factors, they've learned, I can't throw a tantrum in public. I can't yell and scream and throw things at people because that's not okay. That is the environmental factors mediating biological factors. Does that make sense how the relationship between those two works? Yeah. And it'll make more sense as we talk about the 9 different temperament traits. I've talked about that. We're going to take a look at this sensory input when we look at the goodness of it in just a second. So I don't want to say too much about that because I always do, and then we end up being lost. All right, so I'm going to let you watch the 9 different temperament traits first. We can give you a bearing on the next part of lecture. So they'll go over that part first, and then we'll talk about what that means as a caregiver.